Hello and welcome to another Top Grades Made Easy video. As you know, top grades come about when you argue more than one interpretation of a character, because we want to ask ourselves whether Scrooge is psychologically convincing. We're actually going to approach him as he develops from childhood. This is why I'm starting with stave 2. You're going to get all the key quotations in this video and be able to write about each one at a top grade level. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Dickens could make Scrooge do anything. He could climb trees, steal food from the kitchens, make friends with the caretaker's pet, but he didn't, because he wasn't writing Harry Potter. Instead, he makes a child read because he has two purposes. Firstly, it explores Dickens' recurring passion about education and literacy as a way out of poverty and therefore a way to change society. Secondly, it explores Scrooge as a person with a creative imagination. This creativity is going to be so important. Otherwise, Scrooge is just a hilarious villain with some brilliant one-liners, and we don't believe that he'll change. But if he has a creative imagination, then that creativity makes change possible. He's going to react to Marley's ghost as proof that he is imagining things, perhaps through indigestion or strange ingredients in his food. He teases Marley's ghost. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Dickens also emphasises his imagination and humour to make us think about Scrooge in particular ways. He doesn't want the reader to be alienated by Scrooge, but to like him, which will make the transformation more believable at the end. Next, he tells us what the young Scrooge was reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba! Yes, yes! I know, one Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come, just like that. Poor boy." Dickens makes Ali Baba an even more important piece of information than knowing Scrooge was abandoned at school by his cold father. That's why he keeps repeating it and putting it first. He is wonderfully real, again to emphasise 2 points. The first, that the power of reading and the power of literacy and education is truly transformative. Secondly, Scrooge's imagination is very highly developed so that Ali Baba seems real. Therefore, when we get to the eventual transformation, we can believe that that is also more real. Scrooge can imagine this future that's totally different from his past self. Now, Dickens might also use Ali Baba because he comes from a deliberately non-Christian tradition. He features in The Arabian Nights, which was first translated in 1811, but had become popular in a new translation in 1838. Here, you can use this to show that Dickens is not really interested in the Christian viewpoint or the religious viewpoint so much as trying to show us that Christmas is a time for all humanity. It is about celebrating our humanity to our fellow man. You can also use this to argue that Scrooge has an outsider's perspective, which is why he's drawn to non-Christian figures. But I'd like to argue that instead he is an insider, because he reads the same books that Dickens' readers are reading, because Dickens is suggesting Scrooge is an extreme version of his readers. The difference is that Scrooge is going to undergo a dramatic change. Now this becomes a challenge where Dickens will symbolically ask his readers, will you change your views on the poor and will you choose to make a better future, or will you simply discard this tale along with the Christmas wrapping paper? Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you, and you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world. Fran is a two-dimensional character in the sense that Dickens only introduces her for, you've guessed it, two reasons. Firstly, she can die and add a further level of grief and psychological explanation for Scrooge becoming a frozen, emotionless miser. Secondly, she can become the mother of Fred, who exists as the structural counterpoint to Scrooge. Everything that Scrooge is, Fred isn't. He is the mirror in which we can see Scrooge's future self. Fred is a wonderful human being, generous about Scrooge, even defending him to others and insisting that there is still hope of changing him. Fred, remember, also shares 25% of Scrooge's genes and DNA, and so he helps us see that Scrooge's transformation might actually be possible. But the real point of this quotation in this scene is what Fran reveals about Scrooge's father. Although he has created a heaven at home, Scrooge is still not welcome. Fran has had to beg her father repeatedly over time to let Scrooge live at home, even during the school holidays. His father has frightened her in the past, but now that he is partially transformed, she says, I was not afraid to ask him once more. Well, there are so many top grade ideas to explore here. Firstly, his father is still cold and indifferent, which is why he hasn't come with Fran to welcome Scrooge home. And Dickens also portrays heaven as an illusion. Although a transformed father will no longer be deliberately cruel, he's still cold and distant. Dickens might also have been drawing a parallel to the greatest transformation of all, the God of the Old Testament, who becomes the God of the New Testament. The old God drowned a whole planet, apart from those on the ark, with Noah, because he didn't like the way they behaved. The new God, on the other hand, sacrificed his only son, allowing mankind to kill Jesus, and then forgiving humanity rather than taking terrible revenge. We could argue that Dickens does this because he wants to tap into his readers' Christian faith and use it to help them believe that great transformation is possible. And you're to be a man. He uses this to suggest a psychological point. The embittered Scrooge which we see in the future is created in his childhood. That's when the pattern of attachment occurs. Next, we jump forward to when he is an apprentice at Fezziwig's. Now, in Dickens' time, an apprenticeship lasts for 7 years. We might expect that 7 years of positive influence with Fezziwig might change the negative influence of his childhood. But Dickens points out this didn't happen. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. Why does he make Scrooge relive every moment so passionately? One reason is that it foreshadows the final transformation where Scrooge can become, much like his younger self, a better man. But then we should ask, why did 7 years with such a wonderful role model as Fezziwig, where Scrooge seems truly out of his wits happy, without the need of any illegal substance whatsoever, why did that not have a profound effect on Scrooge as an adult, or even a really small effect? It also makes us wonder how he ever turned into this misanthropic miser that we meet in stave 1. So critics use this to argue that Dickens isn't really interested in being psychologically convincing. The scene with Fezziwig is just there to make a political and social point about how employers should behave. You can argue that with this quotation. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. Here Dickens is preaching through Scrooge's epiphany, which is a sudden and profound understanding, steal that word, epiphany, that even our small kindnesses add up to a profound change. All readers, he implies, can make a small change in their own lives which will improve society as a whole and the lives of the poor. Then Dickens makes totally clear, just in case any business owners are nodding off as their family read to them, I suppose, that all businessmen should always think of their employees' well-being. Consequently, Scrooge immediately asks, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's his employee, Bob. Next we find out that Scrooge starts out as a moneylender. Now, before we get to Bell, it's worth asking why Dickens made Scrooge a moneylender rather than a factory owner or a railway magnate or an arms dealer. After all, these are disreputable trades which would give him many more employees whose lives he could change. Well, we can argue that having only one employee makes a better case to the reader, because every reader can imagine changing their responsibilities and behaviour to just one poor person. Giving Scrooge a large workforce would distance him more from ourselves. But Dickens is also tapping in to his readers' Christian knowledge. Jesus attacked money lending because the moneylenders took up business in the temple, the house of God and prayer. Dickens actually described this scene in the book he wrote for his own children that wasn't published till long after his death. And in it he says, "But when our Lord came into the temple, he was very angry, for he saw in it oxen and sheep, doves and pigeons waiting to be sold to people for sacrifice, and tables with heaps of money on them that came from all lands. For the men whose the tables were changed the gold of far-off countries for the Jews' money." So this helps the Victorian reader see Scrooge not just as dislikable, but outright sinful and anti-Christian. He builds on this Christian imagery in the next quotation. "Another idol has displaced me, a golden one. You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you." Here we are with another gold mine of a quotation for seeking top grades. Dickens makes Belle characterise Scrooge not just as a miser hoarding money. She uses the religious imagery to show that Scrooge is worshipping false idols rather than just money. The King James Bible is actually pretty obsessed with idols and contains over 100 warnings against worshipping them, including one of the 10 Commandments. Dickens had in mind the link between idols and gold, which the Bible also condemns as unchristian and heathen. The idols of the heathen are silver and gold, it says in Psalms. Bell also offers us a psychological interpretation of Scrooge's motivation in worshipping the idol of wealth. She tells us they were poor and content to be so. So what changed wasn't a fear of poverty, it was a fear of the world. Now this might sound vague. It isn't though when we think of the lonely boy talking to Ali Baba in the empty classroom, because it is the world which has abandoned him, and so he, following his pattern of attachment, will abandon the world. I'll explain more of that later. Then she specifically says Scrooge fears the chance of the world's sordid reproach. Now, one meaning of this is that the poor are criticised by the wealthy for being dirty. That's what she means by sordid. Everyone treats you with disgust when you're poor, and treating you with disgust is what reproach means. But look again, it is the world which is sordid here, not the poor, specifically the world's reproach, the world's criticism is sordid. So who has been criticising Scrooge that has made him think this way about himself? Well, of course, it's his father. Think about this. Where is Scrooge's mother? She's entirely absent from the story, even in the past, because we must infer she's dead. Presumably, after her death, Scrooge has been sent away to school by a father who dislikes him so much that he won't even let him come home, even at Christmas. Then he's rescued by his sister Fran, but his father still remains distant. How does the world reproach Scrooge? Well, first his mother dies, she metaphorically abandons him. Then Fran dies and metaphorically abandons him again. Then he falls in love with Belle. And guess what? She too abandons him, breaking off their engagement with "I release you." So what does pattern of attachment theory predict Scrooge will do? Incredibly, it says he will recreate these awful relationships from his youth, unconsciously, even if they damage him, because he won't be aware that that is what he's doing. He was abandoned by his mother, then his father, so he is naturally drawn to Belle because she is likely to abandon him. You probably haven't spotted that she is much younger than him. Let me show you. The ghost immediately takes Scrooge and us to visit Belle as a mother 7 years ago at Christmas Eve. Scrooge watches Belle with her husband, their teenage daughter and the other children. The narrator, who has what a modern reader would call a creepy attraction to the older daughter, describes Scrooge grieving because such a daughter could have been his and been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life. That word winter implies that Scrooge, only 7 years after this scene, is already in the winter of his life. Every description of him in the novel confirms it. He's already an old man. So Belle must have been much younger than Scrooge to have such a young family and a baby only 7 years ago. The average age of marriage for a woman in London in 1861 was around 24. And 20 years before that, when this book was written, it might have been as old as 25. So if Belle's daughter is a maximum of 19 years old, Belle is now no older than 44, which is quite an old age to have a baby, so she might even be younger than that. So one reason to choose a much younger partner is it increases the likelihood that, as you age, she will leave you. This is Scrooge's unconscious desire. He doesn't realise that when he falls in love with Belle, but it's caused by his pattern of abandonment, and that's his pattern of attachment. Next, we know that his father was deeply critical of him. So what does he do? He seeks a career which society deeply criticises. He becomes a moneylender. That's the importance of that choice. He was alone as a child, and therefore as an adult he chooses to have no friends, because he's reproducing his early childhood relationships. His only companion is Marley, who we could argue is an older version of himself, another moneylender who's also isolated. However, remember, Scrooge was his sole mourner. Marley has no other friends either. Now, Dickens deliberately links Belle and Marley. He suggests that Scrooge has rejected a partnership with Belle and replaced it with a partnership with Marley. Remember, Scrooge and Marley are not just business partners, they live together in the same house. They are partners in the same way that a married couple are. When Marley dies, Scrooge inherits. It's also worth considering that he has also chosen Marley because he's older and therefore likely to die first. And guess what? That is another abandonment. He knows Marley is likely to abandon him too. This explains the otherwise strange details Dickens gives us of Marley's appearance. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots. Now, the pigtail was no longer fashionable for a man in 1843 when the novel is written. Although it's set earlier, at some unspecified date, the snowy Christmas scene would fit the late 1830s. The British Army introduced regulations to ban the pigtail in 1800, while the Navy did the same in 1820. Before that, it had been part of the regulation cut. Now, Marley, as an efficient miser, is simply maintaining the fashion of his youth, which is cheaper, and growing his hair long is again cheaper to maintain. But the main reason for this detail is to point out their different ages. Dickens wants us to realise Marley was always likely to abandon Scrooge. He could have simply made Marley the same age who died earlier, but he doesn't. He wants us to know really specifically that Scrooge has chosen a partner who will abandon him because he's much more likely to die first. This is Dickens' way of exploring Scrooge's psychological attachment to being abandoned. Scrooge can't stop himself reproducing these relationships. When the Ghost of Christmas Past shows him Belle and her family, he is reminded of the death of Marley because Belle's husband brings it up. What does Scrooge do? He physically attacks the ghost. This is a break in his personality which reveals the strong psychological reason for Scrooge needing to change. He doesn't just realise that he's wasted his life by loving money. He realises at this moment that he's been the victim of attachment. He has allowed his early childhood experience to influence all his later relationships in life. This is a moment of psychological clarity which will make his eventual transformation much more convincing. Now we can go to stave 1. Dickens reveals everything that we've just found out about in stave 2. In stave 1, he wants us to see Scrooge as a larger-than-life theatrical figure. He's a villain with brilliant dialogue. The idea is to make us find Scrooge funny and enjoy him. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, not wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Dickens really wants us to enjoy the repetition, the anaphora of no and the alliteration of wintry weather and wind, emphasising Scrooge's cold personality. Then there's the driving rhythm of the plosive P in purpose, pelting, open. This creates more than just a memorable character. On a purely financial level, Dickens needs his readers to buy this very expensive book. What do when they open the first page to decide? They ask, 1. Will this book entertain me? 2. Will it entertain my family? when I read it out loud. Every technique I've just focused on is about sound. And Dickens introduces sound because he wants the book to be read out loud as a theatrical experience. The extended metaphor comparing Scrooge to this terrible winter weather is carefully placed to prepare us for the eventual transformation. Because what happens to snow? It melts. What happens to winter? Well, the season's passed. So there is a hint that Scrooge himself might thaw. Another hint that Scrooge will change is the relish with which the narrator uses the past tense with, "Oh, but he was," which could clearly suggest in the future he's different. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Obviously, Dickens is still selling the performance value of his tale because everything is so rhythmic. The constant refrain of the past participles, the ing endings, the hyperbolic list of verbs, the sibilants everywhere suggesting his evil nature, and the harsh consonants of the C and K suggests his cold cruelty. The effect, though, is deliberately comic. Imagine the final simile, solitary as an... Well, how many of you would guess the bizarre addition of an oyster? So first, that's there to make us laugh. Secondly, to a Victorian audience, oysters weren't solitary at all. If you've ever seen them growing on the rocks, they cluster in thousands. Oysters were also eaten by the working class. They were widely available, sold on nearly every street corner in London. So Dickens doesn't pick on the oyster because oysters are solitary things. He does pick on the oyster because it exists inside a shell, but also because it's a symbol of poverty. Another thing it symbolises, of course, is Scrooge's transformation in being not a single oyster, but one of many. He's going to learn to love his fellow man. You've probably also interpreted this as the oyster potentially containing a pearl within, and yes, that does symbolises Scrooge's possible transformation again. But remember, solitary is deliberately and comically wrong. It's there to make us laugh. Another part of the imagery which suggests that Scrooge is going to transform is the idea of Scrooge being a flint, which, as you can see, is what you would use to start a fire. And the image suggests a fire has not started yet, but of course it will by the end of the novel. Next, Dickens emphasises Scrooge's wit. We are used to these in loads of action movies. I particularly love them with Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Bond. But it seems that Dickens kind of invents the idea of the evil villain with great one-liners. "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." The reader is intended to partly agree with this, as anyone who's been to America will tell you. After you've heard "Have a nice day" 20 times on the same day, you feel yourself, metaphorically of course, reaching for something sharp. The alliterative B's also add to the enjoyment of this humour, again demanding to be performed out loud. I hope I did it justice. The stake of holly through the heart is also a kind of genre joke. The genre we're used to is the vampire tale, and this is exactly the kind of ghost story Dickens readers might expect at Christmas, one that's just going to scare them. But oh no, Dickens wants to do much more. He wants to educate his readers and change their behaviour. We could also argue that Scrooge's humour is also aimed at middle-aged men and older. It's worth pausing to consider why Dickens made Scrooge a much older man. He would certainly have more time to improve the life of others if he were in his 40s rather than in his 60s. And there's also the endless fatal diseases in Victorian times, so he could still kill him off as a younger man and be plausible, so a younger Scrooge could still be faced with the image of his own grave unless he changes his outlook. Imagine you are Dickens and you want to make a real difference to the treatment of the poor. You want people to reach deep into their own pockets and give to charity. Who is your ideal reader? Who has amassed enough savings and controls the family's financial affairs? Middle-aged men. Scrooge is therefore an extreme version of this male reader who will want to hold on to their hard-earned money rather than give it away to the idle poor. Dickens consciously gives Scrooge dialogue to represent this view that the poor were idle and deserve their poverty because of their laziness. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I've mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. You've probably been taught that Thomas Malthus, 1766 to 1834, an economist, suggested this view that the poor should die off because they consume too many resources. Now that's a bit harsh on poor old Thomas Malthus, who was in fact a reverend and unlikely to interpret Jesus' teaching as saying, let's kill off the poor. However, he did believe in population control and thought it would be a really great idea if poor people stopped having children. They couldn't afford to feed. Now, Thomas Malthus wrote famously about this problem, was very influential, but died in 1834, 9 years before this book was published. And the problem is not with Thomas Malthus, but the people who then used his ideas and changed them. This is called the Malthusian view. So politicians used this as an excuse to treat the poor very badly indeed. Consequently, he gets Scrooge to ask, are there no prisons? The Treadmill and the Poor Law are in full vigour then? Because Scrooge's view is a proxy for the political view of the time. Therefore, many of Dickens' readers will recognise their own thoughts in Scrooge's harsh question. Even Scrooge is shocked at his one-liner, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population, which is why he immediately qualifies it with, besides, excuse me, I don't know that. Even he worries that actually people won't go so far as to kill themselves rather than go to the workhouse. This change in his point of view has to be there so that we don't dislike Scrooge too much. In stave 3, there is some more preparation for Scrooge's transformation. Here Dickens uses Scrooge to tell the reader that he's teaching them a lesson. And so Scrooge asks, Spirit, I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. You can also point out that Scrooge deliberately uses a metaphor about profit to show that he is no longer thinking like a miser in purely financial terms. Knowledge and education is now profit in his mind. So Dickens is preparing for that transformation, following the lesson he's been taught. Now, why do Dickens and Scrooge himself as a character focus so much on Tiny Tim? Well, it's fashionable to laugh at Dickens for his terrible sentimentality. And when I was a younger man, I couldn't bear to read Dickens because I found him far too sentimental. My favourite quotations about Dickens is from Oscar Wilde, who said, one must have a heart of stone to read the death of Little Nell without laughing. In other words, he found Dickens totally implausible. But now I'm older, there's another way of looking at this. Spirit, said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, tell me if Tiny Tim will live? Okay, well, let's focus on his newly awakened interests. It's highly probable that in all the years Bob Cratchit has worked for him, Scrooge has never known about Tiny Tim. Scrooge's irritation with Bob's Christmas spirit in stave 1 came out with this. My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about a Merry Christmas, I'll retire to Bedlam. So he just mentions a family, no individuals. Tiny Tim is somebody he's not heard of. After all, if he had, then Tiny Tim would be another reason for Bob not to be merry, and Scrooge would have mentioned it. Because Tiny Tim suffers from poor health and they're worried about him dying. We can also infer that Scrooge identifies with Tiny Tim, because Tiny Tim is going to face the ultimate abandonment. He's going to die. Scrooge also sees Bob as an incredibly loving father, a complete contrast to his own. And he too will be abandoned by Tiny Tim. So this makes fatherhood the heart of the novel, as we saw with Scrooge's pattern of attachment. First with the treatment of his own father, then the pain of seeing Belle and her family. Scrooge's change of personality and outlook starts with his ability to suddenly imagine what fatherhood might be like. And that's going to lead to breaking the pattern of attachment and feeling that he's like a father to Tiny Tim at the end of the novel. Dickens is also making a social and political point with the character of Tiny Tim. If Scrooge can make Bob more wealthy, Tiny Tim can have a better diet and therefore a better chance of survival. This isn't just some theoretical link, because in Victorian times it would actually have been visible. You would notice just by looking at children that they were suffering from many of the illnesses of the time, and modern historians can see it just by looking at photographs. And studies estimate that anything from 1/3 to half of children in cities suffered from malnutrition and rickets. This was caused by the lack of vitamin D. Where does vitamin D come from apart from the diet? In sunlight. How was sunlight denied to children? Because there were over 1 million chimneys pumping out coal smoke. And without sunlight, bones didn't grow properly. The poor, of course, couldn't get their vitamin D from diet because they couldn't afford a good diet. And the same is true for rates of tuberculosis, a lung disease. So when we look at Tiny Tim, he doesn't just die because Dickens is manipulating his readers sentimentally. He dies because so many Victorian children did. Child mortality was everywhere, and you'd see it on the streets near where you lived. So now Scrooge learns this powerful lesson that if he doesn't change his behaviour, people will die. And that's the same message that he's giving to the readers. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, returned the ghost, we will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. So here, of course, he uses Scrooge's words against him, but in the same way he's using that Malthusian political view against his readers who, to some degree, share it. But this, I think, is also Scrooge's psychological turning point. Dickens, of course, lays on some more gothic melodrama where Scrooge is going to meet a trio of characters who have been literally stealing the sheets and curtains from his corpse's bed and the shirt off his corpse's back. And then we're going to get the climactic moment at the end of the stave where Scrooge gets down on his knees facing his own gravestone. But that's not the turning point. The turning point happens here when he considers the impact he might have on Tiny Tim's life. And that's because Dickens wants to make the interesting stuff psychological. Scrooge has already made the connection of the death of Tiny Tim to his own death. Let me show you. Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead. So as soon as he understands about Tiny Tim's fate, he immediately links to the idea of this dead man that he's seen being him. It's not his death that worries him, it's the fact that if he dies, Tiny Tim will then die. The death of Tiny Tim makes Scrooge understand his own death. When he says, "I know not how," it also shows that Scrooge is now developing a leap of intuition, an unconscious reasoning. And this unconscious reasoning, this intuition, is replacing that other unconscious force, which was the pattern of attachment. And that's why I think this is the real psychological moment in the novel where Scrooge changes. Scrooge also realises that he has learnt the final part of his lessons, and that's why he realises this must be the parting moment with the ghost. Now that's important because it does tell us that the transformation has a real psychological honesty. It's not just a trick that Dickens is playing. The honesty would actually be lost if we think that his final motive is seeing his own grave, because that would just be less pure, wouldn't it? He's just wanting to save himself. But if the only reason he wants to save himself is to save Tiny Tim, I find that much more convincing and much more likeable in the character. Psychologically, it also means he's going to have to become a father figure to Tiny Tim and therefore break the pattern of abandonment in his own life. Dickens focuses on the psychological change in other ways. Scrooge says, "I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year." But then he adds really bizarrely, "I will live in the past, the present and the future." That seems a bit odd, doesn't it? Why will he continue to live in the past? Well, because the past is what makes psychological sense of him becoming a miser in the first place, and now makes psychological sense when he realises he can break the behaviours of the past and break the patterns of attachment. He also refers to the idea of learning lessons. Now, if you go to any of the experts, BBC Bitesize or Spark Notes or York Notes or CGP, whatever, they all talk about one lesson. Well, you can easily guess what it is. It's the need to learn to be generous and look after the poor and be nice. It's basically a really simple message. Actually, that sells the novel short. Dickens knows that wouldn't work. It's the same as telling lots of unhealthy fat people not to eat too much. Yeah, we all know that lesson, but do we change? Hell no. Pass me a biscuit. No, Dickens knows he needs to be able to change the reader's behaviour, which is why he needs them to get an insight into the way their own mind works. He's asking them to revisit their own past and ask, how does that past influence my present? Is my future going to be any better if I'm continually influenced by the behaviours I had when I was young and I do nothing about this? Scrooge is different because he has finally understood the why. He now knows how his past has been influencing him. Now, just in case his readers haven't worked this point out, he begins stave 5 with the same idea. Scrooge repeats, "I will live in the past, the present and the future." Dickens keeps pushing his readers to re-evaluate their own pasts and the impact of those childhoods on their current actions. If you want to chuck in a bit of context here, many critics point to Scrooge as representing the difficult relationship Dickens had with his own father, who couldn't afford to be bringing up 10 children in their house in Camden Town, and his father was actually then sent to debtor's prison. Years later, when Dickens was successful, his father John would still write to Dickens' friends asking for money. Scrooge's desire for money, critics argue, springs from Dickens' father. The poverty of the Cratchits is also in Camden Town, so we can definitely argue Dickens is reliving his own childhood in some ways in this novel. Now, the usefulness of this kind of context is we can show that Dickens doesn't just want us to give to the poor. That's not his main message. He wants us to revisit our past selves, as he is doing, and see what damage our childhoods are doing to our adult lives. Scrooge also delivers some political messages for Dickens in Stave 5. "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge, "I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer, and therefore I'm about to raise your salary." So Scrooge is now used to convey Dickens' social message. His reference to Bob, an employee, as my friend, tells all employers who are reading the book that they should think of their employees as friends. Not literally, they're not going to go out together, but they are going to deserve the same consideration and kindness as they would give a friend. Next, he points out that it's not enough just to be kind. You also must make a financial effort. You've got to raise the salary. This is like a campaign for a minimum wage, which would have had a huge impact, as we saw, improving the diet of the poor, therefore lowering childhood mortality. It would make a massive difference, not just to people's lives, but to their chance of being alive. Next, he says, "I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby." Dickens wants us to understand that the lesson he's teaching is just as radical as moving from being an old man to being a baby. It would be easy for his readers just to gloss over the social message and think, yeah, I've just got to give a little bit to charity, life will be better for everyone. But instead, Dickens uses this imagery from Scrooge to suggest that no, you don't just want to give a little bit to charity, you need to totally transform the way you think about the world. This is why Scrooge incongruously and humorously imagines himself as a baby. Of course, this symbolism is also deeply Christian. Scrooge is waking up on Christmas Day, the day Jesus was born. He is also the baby. Dickens wants the reader to think of this particular baby. Even to an atheist, the question, what would Jesus do, is a powerful question. Dickens himself didn't have a massively strong Christian faith, but he did see Jesus as a brilliant teacher with fantastic moral lessons. In fact, Dickens rewrote the Gospels for his own children in 1849, 6 years later. And this book focuses on Jesus mainly as a teacher who kind of performs miracles on the side. This helps us to see Scrooge as a teaching aid who teaches us lessons, yes, about generosity, yes, about social responsibility, yes, about our duties as employers, but crucially about how to examine our own patterns of attachment, examine our own past, which cling to us like Marley's chains, binding us to actions we can't escape until, for the first time, we see they're there and we can break them. The novel ends with Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man. His final lesson reinforces all of those lessons I've just mentioned. The first three are emphasized in the triplet: to be a good friend, master, man. The last one, the psychologically important one, to break the pattern of attachment. He does this when he chooses to become a second father to Tiny Tim, so laying the ghost of his own father. And if you want to chuck in an extra contextual point, we can also imagine Dickens doing the same, trying to lay the ghost of his own father, and to become a better father himself to his 5 children, which would eventually grow to 10. The final point we can make about Scrooge here is Dickens' desire not to have such a large family, and there is perhaps a hint of envy that Scrooge only has to worry about one surrogate son. Well, eventually this incredibly detailed analysis will be in a revision guide. Look out for it in the description below. In the meantime, check out this video on the left to learn more.